Today I'm going to look at Melee from the Fantasy Trip series. Metagaming Microgame number 3 from Steve Jackson. It's the basic combat rules for the Fantasy Trip RPG system. This is the 4th edition. The earlier editions, copyright 1977-79 by Steve Jackson, revised edition 1980 by Metagaming. I believe this boxed version, which is the 4th edition, came out in 1981. Apparently the cover is the same as the 2nd edition, which is well done. It's always unusual in these combat games when seems they're a little bit lacking in armor class as far as their depictions, but he must have been successful against this monster. And actually the art is very well done, quite detailed. Really appreciate that. It's a small box, has all the metagaming microgames. Description on the back: Melee is the combat module for the Fantasy Trip RPG system. And then there's also Wizards, which is the magic module. And I'm playing on it eventually. I'll do Melee now, and then I'll do Wizard at some point in the future. And then they have some game modules where you use those. For instance, Death Test is one I'll do that uses both. That one can be Blade Salter, so I'm looking forward to doing Death Test, which is an application of this once I get that off eBay. Melee is a fast action game of bows, axes, halberds, and other cold steel weapons. Create your fantasy fighter by selecting arms, armor, and fighting attributes. In the arena, face the skilled killer or beast. Can pit teams against each other. 4th edition edited by Guy McLemore Jr., Howard Thompson, cover by Roger Stein, illustrations by Pat Heide and Liz Danforth. Again, the development in 1977-79 by Steve Jackson, and then copyright 1980 by Metagaming. In my understanding, there's a more recent release from Steve Jackson of these legacy games. And as always, I appreciate subscriptions. Looking forward to continuing to build my library here, and appreciate any feedback as I go along. Components comes with a small 6-sided dice, 24-page rulebook, black and white. Talk about that in detail. It's always fun in these old games too, when you get various advertisements. Here's press releases from Metagaming. Surprisingly small font. Apparently there's a $10,000 treasure hunt. They have one of their games is the Treasure of the Silver Dragon, which is in this Fantasy Trip series, and somehow in concert with that game you can actually search for $10,000, which I don't know what that would be in today's dollars, but the fall 1980 catalog. As far as counters, in the counter sheet, you can take them out. There's 68 counters representing men, animals, monsters, and the small ones are the dropped weapons. And they're thin. It's like a cardstock. They're one-sided. Two different kind of background colors. I said these are the dropped weapons. There's various weapons. Daggers, rapiers, clubs, hammers, various swords, axes, maces, javelin spears, bows, etc. Then of course when you set up your fighters, you can choose which one of these you want to use to represent them. Counters vary in size. the bigger, these kind of normal square ones, I think we'll say they're 11/16 of an inch. Then you have smaller ones, which are the dropped weapons, and then some bigger ones, which like 1.25 inch height. Some of the various creatures are bears, wolves, giant snakes, giants, gargoyles, orcs, hobgoblins, goblins, elves, dwarves, halflings, and humans. In the book there's various tables of characteristics of the monsters and weapons. And there's so for your character you develop a character sheet and you photocopy these off and fill them out. As you can see, there's strength, dexterity, intelligence, which is useful for the wizards, adjusted dexterity, the ready weapons, slung weapons, experience points, and then notes. Comes with a 8.25 inch by 14 inch arena map, of course with hexes, and then these ones with thicker borders are the mega hexes. I think the color scheme works pretty well as far as contrasting with the counters. And it's it's kind of a thickish paper. Going through the rules here, so of course this deals with the fighter to fighter combat. First of all, you gotta create a figure. Fighter's basic attributes are strength and dexterity. Strength is ST, dexterity is DX. When a figure is first created, the player determines its ST and DX as follows. Human figure starts with 8 strength, 8 dexterity, and 8 extra points to be allotted as the player chooses. Strength governs how many hits a figure can take. The hits a figure takes are subtracted from its ST. When ST reaches 1, a figure collapses and cannot fight. And when ST reaches 0, the figure is dead. Governs what weapons a figure can use. Each weapon has an ST number. Only a figure whose ST begins at or above that number can use a weapon. And 3, how well the figure does in enter in combat is determined from ST. Dexterity governs 1, how likely a figure is to hit an enemy. 2, how easily a figure can disengage from an enemy. 3, how quickly a figure can strike. Dexterity is adjusted for several factors such as armor, wounds, etc. When these rules refer to DX, the adjusted DX is what is meant. The figure who gains experience by surviving combat may gain strength and dexterity, and time become more powerful with increased experience. The player should decide what armor, if any, the figure will wear, and what weapons under shield he or she will carry. A figure may only carry 2 weapons plus a dagger at a time. Shields affect a figure's protection but reduce its dexterity and movement allowance. Record sheet or card should be made up for each figure. And then turn sequencing. It's played out in a series of turns, each representing about 5 seconds. Each turn is divided into several phases. Generally, each figure may move only during the movement phase and perform actions, including attacks, only during the action phase. The actions a figure may take will depend on how far it moved, whether or not it is engaged or disengaged, or in hand-to-hand combat. Engaged figure is one that is adjacent to an enemy figure in one of the figure's front hexes. Nothing in melee happens simultaneously. Each movement and action may affect the next one. Each turn goes through the following phases. First, initiative roll. The high roller may choose to move his figure first. 2, movement. The first player to move executes movement for his figures. 3, second player movement. 4, action. All actions, including attacks, are carried out. Figures act in the order of their adjusted dexterity. Highest first to lowest last. When figures are firing 2 arrows per turn, they fire their second arrow in adjusted dexterity order after all figures have made their first actions. If a figure is killed or takes 8 or more hits and falls down before it's time to act occurs, it does not get to act that turn. The figure that is knocked down must wait until next turn's action phase to get up. Forced retreat. If any figure inflicts hits except by missile or thrown weapons on an enemy figure and took no hits itself, you may retreat the enemy figure 1 hex in any direction and either advance to the hex vacated by the enemy or stand still, thus possibly becoming disengaged. Counter placements. Counters for thrown or dropped weapons are placed in the appropriate hexes, and counters for slain or unconscious figures are flipped upside down. If there are still 2 competing sides of the figures able to fight in the arena, then begin a new turn of combat. Actions. A figure may perform only 1 action per action phase of a turn. Actions the player may perform are constrained by how far the figure moved that turn and whether or not it is engaged, disengaged, or in hand-to-hand combat. HTH is short for hand-to-hand combat. Actions for disengaged figures. 1 may move more than half its MA and take no other action. 2 may move up to half its MA and charge an attack with any weapon except a missile weapon. 2C dodge. D drop, a prone or kneeling position. 3 move 2 hexes and ready new weapon. The figure reslings any ready weapon and may ready new weapon or pick up a dropped weapon in the hex he occupies. The ready and resling process covers 1 weapon per or shield for each hand. Move only 1 hex and missile weapon attack. For a ready missile weapon at a target, stand still, not moving, and stand up. Rise from prone, kneeling, or knocked down position during the movement phase of the turn and take no other actions. This is all the figures may do for the turn. Then actions for engaged figures. 1. Shift 1 hex while remaining engaged, and H. Attack with any ready non-missile weapon. I. Defend. J. Charge weapons. Drop a ready weapon. Any new non-missile weapon. K. Attempt in combat. Move into the hex of any adjacent enemy and attempt to hit with bare hands or a dagger. Any non-dagger ready weapons are dropped. L. Disengage. Attempt to move away from an opponent's front hex. 2. Stand still. And M. Last missile shot attack. A figure with a ready loaded missile weapon may get off a last shot if it became engaged during the movement phase. The missile weapon must be dropped next turn. You can almost always release an arrow at a charging enemy. N. Stand up. O. Pick up weapon. Drop ready weapons and or shield and pick up and ready dropped weapon in the occupied hex. Then actions for figures in hand-to-hand combat. P. Attack. Hand-to-hand. Attempt to hit an opponent in the same hex only with bare hands or a dagger. Q. Attempt to draw a slung dagger. R. Attempt to disengage. Movement. Figures begin the game in any of the 4 entrance hexes starred at opposite ends of the arena. Each figure has a movement allowance, MA, of a certain number of hexes. An unarmored human has an MA of 10, that is, can move 10 hexes per turn. Armor reduces MA. Leather armor, MA is 8. Chainmail, 6. Plate armor, MA 4. MAs for non-humans are given under non-human figures table. Shifting. Only disengaged figures have options which let them move their full MA. An engaged figure may move only 1 hex during movement and must stay adjacent to all figures to which it is engaged. This is called a shift. In the list of options, figures in hand-to-hand combat may not move at all until they successfully disengage. Moving onto other figures, normally only 1 figure occupies a hex. A figure may never move through a standing or kneeling figure. A figure may move into a hex with a fallen figure and stop, or may move into another figure's hex for hand-to-hand combat and stop. A figure may jump over an unconscious, dead, or prone figure at a cost of 3 from its MA. Whenever a figure jumps over another figure or ends its move in a hex with a fallen figure, it immediately rolls 1 die. On a roll of 6, it stumbles and immediately falls down in the hex with the other figure. The figure must stop its movement when it enters any front hex of an enemy figure, thus becoming engaged. See facing. Facing, each figure faces one side of its hex. as shown in the direction of the counter is turned. A player may change the facing of a figure whenever it moves, and it may always change its facing at the end of its movement turn, even if it stayed in the same hex. A figure on the ground, or when bending over to pick up a weapon, is considered to face rear in all 6 directions. It is no front. However, a prone or kneeling archer has normal front hexes for purposes of determining where he or she may fire. Example shown here. Esther is facing the hex directly above her in the diagram. The 3 hexes marked F are front hexes, the first 3 there. The S hexes are side hexes, and the R is the rear hex. Facing determines which figures are engaged. Figure is engaged if it is in the enemy's front hex. If a figure is behind an enemy, the front figure is engaged, but the rear one is not. Facing also determines which figures may be attacked. Only an enemy in one of your 3 front hexes may be attacked. For missile and thrown weapons, only figures in front of you may be attacked. Attacks. There are several types of attack. Regular thrown weapons, missile weapons, and hand-to-hand. In order to attack except hand-to-hand, a figure must have a ready weapon. The figure has 1 weapon and or shield ready when it enters the arena. A weapon stays ready after an attack unless it is thrown or dropped, except a crossbow, which takes time to reload. In order to change weapons, the figure chooses to ready a new weapon. This takes up to turn. The new weapon can be used at the next turn. A shield, like a weapon, is ready or not. An unready shield is slung on the figure's back. Figures which change weapons, stand up, move more than half their MA, disengage, etc. cannot attack that turn. Only 1 figure may be attacked per turn, except in a figure which fires 2 arrows can fire at 2 different targets. Rolling for a hit. When an attack is made, the attacker rolls 3 dice to determine whether he hit the enemy. To hit, a figure must roll its adjusted dexterity or less on 3 dice. Adjustments to dexterity as follows. So as shown here, for instance, leather armor is -2, chainmail is -3, and other adjustments for shields, plate armor. Facing adjustments to dexterity. Attacking from the side +2, from the rear +4. Missed weapons don't get dexterity adjustments for facing. Wounds. Figure that took 5 or more hits. Last turn dexterity is -2. Figure reduced to extremely less is -3. Dexterity. Thrown weapon range -1. DX for every hex distance to the target. Missed weapon range. No penalty, the target is the same megahex or 1 or 2 megahex distance. -1 if it's 3 or 4 megahexes. -2 if it's 5 or 6 megahexes. And so on. In big arenas. Other adjustments, crossbowman, laying prone is +1. Pull weapon, user standing still, against charging enemy, +2. Missile thrown attack against figure sheltering behind body, -4. Attacks come off in order of adjusted dexterity, counting everything but missile and thrown weapon range. A distant target makes you less accurate but no slower. The roll to hit is adjusted DX or less on 3 dice, as stated above, but 3 always hits and does triple damage, 4 always hits and does double damage, 5 always hits, 16 always misses, 17 always misses, and the attacker drops that weapon in his own hex. A roll of 18 always misses, and the attacker's weapon is broken. Rolling for damage. How much damage he does is determined by another dice roll. How many dice are rolled depends on the attacker's weapon. The result is the number of hits the enemy takes, although his armor will take some of those hits for him. Some weapons have pluses and minuses. A small axe gets 1 + 2, which means you roll 1 die and add 2 to the result. Armor shields. Armor and shields take hits for you, thus protecting you. For instance, plate armor takes 5 hits per attack. If a figure in plate is hit by 3 different attacks in one turn, the armor takes 5 from each attack. Shields work just the same way, except that if shield is ready, it protects you against attacks from the 3 front hexes, and if it is not ready, it protects you against attacks from the rear hex. It does not subtract from your DX. Left-hand dagger acts as a shield to parry 1 hit per attack, non-missile weapons only, from your front hexes. Pole weapons, a figure which charge attacks, which is action B for disengaged figures with a pole weapon, does double damage if the target is hit. The figure's last 3 hexes of movement must be in a straight line and without a facing change. If a figure with a pole weapon stays in the same hex, with or without a facing change, on turn an enemy figure charge attacks him, then the pole weapon figure gets a +2 DX against that enemy on his 2-hit roll, as well as a double damage bonus if he hits. Left-hand dagger. A fighter may use a main gauche or left-hand dagger with any other one-handed weapon. It may be used in 2 ways. One, on any turn the fighter uses it, only as a shield, it stops 1 hit from any non-missile attack and adjusts his DX by -2. 2, on any turn he uses it as a shield and weapon, still stops 1 hit from any non-missile weapon. It also lets him make 2 attacks at turn against the same enemy, one with the main gauche and one with the other weapon. Both attacks are at a DX of -4. Main gauche gets 1 -1 in hit-to-hit combat, in hand-to-hand combat. A fighter may not use 2 daggers or main gauche and dagger in hand-to-hand combat. Thrown weapons. Thrown weapon attack is treated exactly like a regular attack, but there's a dexterity adjustment of -1 for every hex of distance to the target. If a line drawn from the center of the attacker's hex to the center of the target hex passes through any hex containing standing figure, the figure is in the way. A line passing along the edge of a hex does not go through that hex. When a weapon is thrown, the attacker must first roll to miss each figure between him and his target. The attacker makes his dexterity roll as usual, but if he rolls his adjusted DX or below, he misses and the weapon flies past. Otherwise, it hits. You may not roll to miss an enemy. When you are rolling to miss, a 14 becomes an automatic hit, a 15 is a double damage hit, and a 16 is a triple damage hit. 17 means the weapon drops in that hex. 18 means it breaks. When a thrown weapon hits, it falls to the ground in that hex. If a thrown weapon misses its intended target, it continues along the line drawn between the attacker's hex and the target hex for 10 hexes past the target hex. Roll for each same figure whose hex the line passes by. Whether a attacker is trying to hit or to miss, his DX is always adjusted by a -1 for each hex distance to the figure rolled for. Missile weapons. Only a disengaged figure may attack with a missile weapon. However, a figure with a missile weapon ready can get off one shot if suddenly engaged, but must then drop the missile weapon on the next turn. And then the weapons table shows the weapon, the dice, and the strength requirements, and then notes in the table. Asterisk indicates if the weapon may be thrown. The sword symbol indicates it's a 2-handed weapon. And then plate armor and chainmail, different armor types effects, shield effects. Missile weapon fire calls for a dexterity adjustment based on the number of megahexes, distance to the target. If the target is in the same megahex as 1 or 2, there's no adjustment. If it's 3 or 4, it's -1, etc. Otherwise, the missile weapons follow the same line of flight rules as do thrown weapons. A roll of a 17 or 18 on any target, but the first breaks the arrow but does not affect the bow. Missile weapons never get edges for the target's facing. The dexterity adjustments for missile and thrown weapons distance are not considered to determine which figure attacks first. Crossbows normally Fire every second or third turn. Reloading a crossbow comes under the ready weapon option for all purposes. Prone and kneeling fire. Crossbows may be fired from a prone position, and the bow may be fired from a kneeling position. A crossbow may be reloaded from prone or kneeling figure. No other weapon may be readied by a prone or kneeling figure. A crossbow, when lying prone, gets a +2 dexterity adjustment. Sheltering directly behind fallen bodies. Any figure may lie prone or kneel in a hex directly behind a sheltering body. A missile thrown weapon attack then has a chance of hitting that body instead. If the attacker makes his dexterity roll to hit, he must then roll 1 die. If the target figure is prone, he needs a 1, 2, or 3 to hit it instead of the body in front. If the target is kneeling, he needs a 1, 2, 3, or 4 to hit it. Hitting your friends. In the same way, you must roll to miss. In the same way, he must roll to miss a friendly figure when he strikes at an enemy in the friendly figure's hex and misses. This can happen when a standing figure tries to hit an enemy on the ground in hand-to-hand combat and misses. He may then roll 1 by 1 to see if he hits other enemies in that hex. If he misses them all, he must roll 1 by 1 to miss each friendly figure in that hex. He stops rolling when he hits one figure or misses them all. Figures in hand-to-hand combat never hit their friends in the same hand-to-hand combat. Only standing figures striking into the pile must roll. Hand-to-hand combat. Figure may move into an enemy's figure hex, initiating hand-to-hand combat. If the enemy has his back to a wall, is lying down, is prone, is kneeling, has lorem, agrees to hand-to-hand combat, or is attacked through his side or rear hex, initiating hand-to-hand combat is considered an attack. A disengaged figure picks action to initiate hand-to-hand combat, moving into the enemy's hex during movement and attacking during combat. An engaged figure picks action entering the enemy's hex and attacking during combat. If the attacker had his dagger ready already, he may use it in hand-to-hand combat. Otherwise, he drops his ready weapon and shield in the hex he started from and attacks barehanded. When a figure is attacked hand-to-hand, it immediately rolls 1 die to determine his defense against hand-to-hand combat attack as follows. On a roll of 1 or 2, the defender drops his ready weapon and or shield unless the ready weapon is a dagger and fights barehanded. Both figures fall to the ground in the defender's hex. On a roll of 3 or 4, the defender drops his ready weapon and or shield and has time to ready his dagger if he has one. He'll be able to use it in the next attack. Both figures fall to the ground in the defender's hex. On a roll of 5, the defender does not drop his weapon, and the attacker immediately backs up to the hex from which he entered the defender's hex. Hand-to-hand combat does not take place. On a roll of 6, the defender does not drop his weapon and automatically gets a hit on the attacker. The attacker must retreat 1 hex, as above. Hand-to-hand combat does not take place. Since figures in hand-to-hand combat are on the ground and or grappling with their foes, they always get the +4 rear hex dexterity adjustment. During the combat phase, hand-to-hand combat is rolled. A dagger gets a 1+2. Main gauche gets 1-1. Bare hands against a stronger enemy gets 1-4. Bare hands against an enemy of the same strength gets a 1-3, and bare hands against a weaker enemy gets a 1-2. A figure engaged in hand-to-hand combat may try to draw and ready its dagger if it has one by picking action. By picking action on a roll of 1, 2, 3, the dagger was drawn and readied, otherwise nothing happened. Multiple hand-to-hand combat. When 2 figures are rolling around fighting, any other figure can move onto that hex and join the brawl without rolling to see if the attempt is successful. If 2 or more figures are fighting one enemy, the lone fighter's strength is compared to the total enemy strengths to see how many dice he gets. If he is stronger than all put together, he gets 1, 1-2, etc. When there are 2 more figures on the same side in a hand-to-hand brawl, all figures on a side get a 1-3. Figures on the ground in hand-to-hand combat can only attack the enemies they are in hand-to-hand combat with, and may attempt to disengage. If a standing figure attacks an enemy who is down in hand-to-hand combat with other figures and misses, he then rolls for each other enemy in hand-to-hand combat, and then for each friend until he hits someone. If a missile or a thrown weapon is aimed at a pile of figures in hand-to-hand combat, first roll to see if it hit, then roll randomly to see who it hit. It is not a good idea to fire arrows into Brawl. Disengaging. A figure selects the disengage option to move away from a figure which has him engaged. Instead of attacking the disengaging figure, moves 1 hex in any direction when its turn to attack comes. A kneeling, prone, or fallen figure may not disengage. It must first stand up. A figure engaged with more than one enemy figure may disengage from some while remaining engaged with others. A figure may never attack on the turn it disengages, except in hand-to-hand combat. Note that an enemy figure with adjusted dexterity greater than your figure's adjusted dexterity will be able to strike at your figure during the turn in which you disengage. An enemy figure with adjusted dexterity less than or equal to your figure's adjusted dexterity must add the difference between the figure's adjusted dexterity, if any, to his to-hit roll in order to hit your figure. Disengaging from combat. A figure in hand-to-hand combat may not automatically disengage, but must pick the action attempt to disengage. During the movement phase, it does not move, since figures in hand-to-hand remain in the same hex. During its attack phase, it does not attack, but rolls 1 die instead. If its dexterity is superior to the enemies, it needs a 1, 2, or 3. If its dexterity is same or less, or if there are more than 1 enemies, it needs a 1. The figure which disengages from hand-to-hand combat immediately stands up and moves to any adjacent empty hex. Defending and dodging. The defend action for engaged figures and dodge action for disengaged figures have similar effects. Dodging is effective only against thrown weapons and missile weapons. Defending is effective only against non-missile or non-thrown attacks. The defend action for engaged figures and dodge action for disengaged figures have similar effects. A figure must have a ready physical weapon for parrying in order to defend. To hit a dodging or defending figure, you must make your 2-hit roll 4 dice instead of 3 dice. 4 and 5 are automatic hits. 20 and above are automatic misses. 21 and 22 are dropped weapon, and 23 and 24 are broken weapon. Forcing retreat. A figure which hit an enemy figure, missile or thrown weapons hits, or hits taken by an enemy's armor don't count, and is not hit by itself, may force the enemy to retreat 1 hex at the end of the turn. The victorious player moves the enemy figure 1 hex in a direction into any hex which is vacant or contains only a fallen figure. He may then choose either to stay still or to move into the hex from which the enemy retreated. If the enemy has no adjacent vacant hex to retreat to, he must make a saving roll, 3 dice against dexterity to avoid falling in its original hex. Reactions to injury. A figure which takes 5 or more hits in 1 turn has its dexterity adjusted -2 for the next turn only. A figure which takes 8 or more hits in 1 turn immediately falls down if it has not already attacked, and it may not attack that turn. It may do nothing next turn except stand up or stay down. If it is in hand-to-hand combat, it may not do anything at all next turn. Dropped weapons. Dropped weapon counter should be placed in hex where A, a thrown weapon lands, B, a figure is standing when it drops its weapon to ready a new one. Engaged figures must drop their ready weapons to ready a new one. Disengaged figures may resling their ready weapon as they ready a new one, or C, a figure drops its weapon when it rolls 17 on the 2-hit roll. The counter for dead or unconscious figures is assumed to include a dropped weapon counter for each weapon it was carrying when it fell. The non-human figures, all shown in this table here, and then different other types of fighters. For instance, the bear has a movement allowance of 8. He normally does 2 + 2 damage, or 3 dice in hand-to-hand combat. His Furix is armor, takes taking 2 hits per attack. Suggested strength of 30 is a big bear. Suggested dexterity of 11. So as you see, for all the creatures and elves, dwarves, halflings, humans, you have their strength, dexterity, movement allowance, armor, normal damage, and hand-to-hand damage. Experience. Figures which survive combat gain experience, which can increase their strength and dexterity. The experience a fighter gains depends on type of combat and whether the enemy was superior or inferior in total attributes, strength plus dexterity. In multi-figure combats, the average superiority is considered. Combat to the death continues until all on one side are slain. 50 experience points is gained to each survivor, or 70 if the enemy average more than 3 superior in strength plus dexterity. Arena combat continues until all on one side are dead or escape from the door from which they entered. Unconscious figures may not be slain. Winners get 30 experience points. Defeated survivors get 20 experience points unless they ran away unhurt, in which case they lose 10 EP. If one side averages 3 or more weaker in total attribute survivors, on that side get 10 extra experience points. Practice combat. No missile weapons. All weapons are blunted and do half damage. The figure drops out when its strength goes to 3 or less. It's possible to get killed in practice, but difficult. Those still on their feet, when one side is eliminated, get 10 experience points each. Others get nothing but bruises. When a figure gets 100 experience points, he or she may trade them in for 1 additional point, either added to either basic strength or basic dexterity. There is no limit to how a fighter can raise his or her attributes. And the table shows the dexterity adjustment for physical attacks, striking from side, from the rear, cross movement, firing from prone, pull weapon user staying still against charge, hobbit, using missile spell or throwing missile weapons, wizard, using any weapon except staff or dagger, fighter using a weapon in each hand, striking with both. Then dexterity adjustments to the type of target, if it's invisible, blurred, and a shadow hex, 1x figure in flight, giant snake, or a multi-hex figure in flight. Dexterity adjustments for armor and shield, different types of shields, different types of armor. If the main gauche is used as defense only, or wizard whose weapon or armor is iron and steel instead of silver. Then dexterity adjustments for missile weapon range. If it's 0 enter megahexes, no DX subtractions. And then -1 when it's 3 or 4 megahexes, and then for each beyond that it's another -1, so it'd be -2 for 5 and 6 away, etc. Then for the initial Infinity Trip series, these are the games. I'm going to do Melee and Wizard, and then there you have modules in the Labyrinth, Tellenkar's Lair, Death Test 2, Grail Quest, Treasure of the Silver Dragon. Then there's also Advanced Melee and Advanced Wizard. Then we'll get into setup and play. So we'll get to setup and play here. I'm going to have a human warrior battle a giant. And for the human warrior, I'll have, let's call him Alphys the Brave. And initially, for both the human and the giant, I'll use, the counters they have. But then after the first turn or so, I'll switch over to, a 1980s miniature to just put in the board, because it works, of course, really well for miniatures. So you choose to set up the strength and dexterity, set them on these sheets. For human, you start with a strength of 8, dexterity of 8, and then you have 8 more points to distribute between the two. So I'll add 5 onto strength to get a total of 13, and then 3 onto dexterity to get an initial dexterity of 11. Then you choose armor and weapons. I'm going to go with chainmail, which gives a -3 to the adjusted dexterity, and then he has a shield which he can either use or have on his back. So the adjusted and the shield changes the dexterity by -1 because he's less mobile when he's using it, and less mobile when he's using the armor too. So then the adjusted dexterity for without the shield would be load -3 or 8, and when he's using the shield it would be 7, shown there. And when you use chainmail, your movement allowance is 6, shown there. For weapons, looking at the chart here, decided to give him so his strength is good enough. He's got a lot of choices. He's not strong enough to use a two-handed sword, but he can use a Morningstar, broadsword, etc. So he's going to use a broadsword. For a weapon, so he's going to have a shield as well, and also have a ranged weapon. So he'll have a short bow. And then the dice are the damage dice they do. For instance, the broadsword would do 2 dice of damage. A small bow would do one dice minus 1 from that for damage. He'll start with a ready weapon of his short bow, and then later he'll switch over to using his broadsword and shield. So that's him. And for the giant characteristics are shown on the monster chart here. They can have strength of 25 to 50. I'm giving him 35, dexterity of 9, movement allowance of 10, and then you choose a type of weapon. So there's his strength, dexterity, movement allowance. I'm going to give him a mace, which is damage of 2 dice minus 1. And in his other hand, I'll give him a main gauche, which is damage of 1 dice minus 1, and then there's the rules for using that in the second hand. And his hand-to-hand damage is 2 dice minus 1. And we'll get into play. See who goes first. For alphas, 5. Giant. Alphas goes first. He's got a movement allowance of 6. So he's got his short bow ready. He's facing this direction. 1, 2. So beyond his megahex, it's 1, 2, 3 away. There's no penalty for being in or within 1 or 2 away, but once you get 3 or 4 away, it's -1. So he's got a -1 effect. So now the giant will move. He's got a movement of 10. He doesn't have any ranged weapons, so he's going to just try to close in. One, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. He's able to close in on him. He's still on the front side of him though. His weapons are a mace and a main gauche. His dexterity is 9, so he'll roll 3 dice. So he gets well above 9, so he's not going to hit with a mace, which is fortunate for alphas. If he were to use on his left hand On a second hand, if you were to use the main Gosh, he would have had a -4 dexterity adjustment on both the left and right hand, so he's not going to use that since he didn't want that adjustment on the first one. And I'll replace the counters with figures. And these are Grenadier figures from around 1980. The reason the Giant went first in actions after they both did their movement is because he's got the better adjusted dexterity, which is 9, compared to Alphys's, which is 8. And also the Giant takes up these 3 hexes here. And he's gone, and now Alphys will go. He's engaged now, so he's currently got a short bow, and he wants to drop that and use his broadsword instead, so that'll be his action. He can shift 1 hex as well. He'll just try to get a little bit around the Giant here to maybe get to his backside. Then we go to the next turn. Movement. Giant's going to stay right there. Alphys is committed now, so he's not going to try to disengage. He's just going to stay there, and they're going to battle. Giant will go. He'd either, again, combat with his main weapon and main Gosh, but he'd take a -4 dexterity for using both those, or he could use his main weapon and then use his main Gosh to parry, which gives him -2. And he's going to do that this turn. It's actually interesting that if you do the main Gosh, you do parry the attack of the others. It seems like an absolute thing, which is a little bit unusual. So he's going to do that. So he's got a -2 dexterity to try to hit it with his mace. Down to 7. Gets a 7, he does hit. As far as damage, it's 2 -1. And it doesn't, even though he's a Giant, there's not a strength bonus for the amount of damage he does. So it's 2 dice -1, 4, 7, so 6 damage. Chainmail absorbs 3 hits per attack. So Alphys gets a total of 3 damage, so his strength from damage gets down to 10. On his turn, it's not clear if it takes an additional turn to also, like it took him 1 action to drop a weapon to change the weapon in that attack. It's unclear if it also takes 1 action to change his shield and lose an attack. So he's just, I'm just going to say that he saw that the Giant's using a main Gosh, so he's not even going to try to attack. He's just going to change his shield, so that's what he's doing. It is interesting, it's absolute that the main Gosh would have parried, his attack. Now the Giant goes, it's combat. He's not going to parry anything, he's just going to attack with his mace. He has adjusted dexterity is 9 now. Nope. Alphys is going to attack. He's going to shift over here. He's still in the front area of the Giant, but he's kind of getting more towards the rear there. He's using his shield with his broadsword, so his adjusted dexterity is 7. Six, which is 7 or below, so he hits. Damage. With a broadsword, it's 2d. 6, significant. Knocks the giant down from 35 to 29. Now the giant will change his facing so that Alphas doesn't get behind him. Mace gun. Just doing a straight attack, not using his main gosh. 39. Eight hits. Damage. Damage of the mace is 2 minus 1. 2 dice. 3. 7 minus 1, 6. Well, he takes, so 6 hits. His chainmail absorbs 3 of that, so now he's down to 7. Elvis goes. He doesn't think he'll be able to get around him, so he's just going to face him. Attack with his broadsword. Just a dexterity of 7. 1, 5, 8 misses. Hopefully that gives you a little sense of how the play goes. From Metagame, there's other versions from Metagaming with Steve Jackson or Steve Jackson himself, later versions or some earlier versions. Nothing good about it. I like the presentation of it, the box and the simple map, and counters are okay, kind of simple though. The idea, I guess, is to make a simple combat game that can be used in different scenarios, and it is, simple, and there's a lot to be said for simplicity. Although, I have some backgrounds, like a AD&D, Dungeon Master back in the 80s, so of course it's tempting to compare it to, D&D. It's interesting that for this combat version you have your strength and dexterity, and instead of additionally constitution or hit points, that sort of thing. So there's limitations with that. It does make it easier, of course, but the fact that your strength, is your hit points is a little bit interesting how those combine, instead of having, like a separate hit points for that. And some of it also that you don't, for instance, you have a giant that uses a mace, you don't get a, plus something for damage on those by the strength effect. That would have been good. Doesn't have that. It's okay how they do dexterity. And the combat's pretty straightforward. Fairly easy to learn. Works for miniature as well. There's more absolutes in it too. Like if you use a main gosh for parry, you will parry it instead of having a chance of parrying it, for instance. It seems a little bit simplistic. It'll be interesting. I'll look at the wizard one also that adds in magic, and I'll be curious the level of complexity of that. If you're looking for a quick play game, though, it does play quickly, and you can match up different scenarios with different types of monsters or other characters. So that's good. So as long as you're okay with losing those complexities of more complicated bonuses of from different character characteristics, or you're okay with kind of more absolute combat versus more randomization, it's okay. Of course, I still prefer D&D, but they're not directly comparable, of course. You'll be curious how this plays out. I got some missions like the death test that I'm going to try this on, that is a module as well. So as long as you're okay with simplicity and kind of view it as a standalone by its own, it's fine. And it's enough there that I'm interested in looking to see how it applies to scenarios. So I'll give it a 6 out of 10. Thanks a lot.